Hi, I'm Dr. George Yancey. Let's shatter some paradigms. And the paradigm I want to share today concerns white progressive women. Now, you may be asking, why white progressive women? What's about that makes you want to shatter a paradigm? Well, we probably have heard, if you've been in on social media or pay attention to people talking, they talk about white progressive women being a problem. And, maybe they're the white Karens or things of this nature. I personally don't like talking about people being Karens. I think that has a sort of negative connotation that's unwarranted. And I feel bad for people who are actually named Karen. But that talk goes around. I see little videos and hey, look at this Karen or look at this white progressive women. White progressive women are the worst. Now, if you paid attention to this playlist, you know that I critique white progressives, especially educated white progressives. So this comment on the women, this gender angle, has caught my attention. So I ask a basic question. Among the problems that I'm documenting about white progressives, are women worse than men? Does this stereotypical image of white progressive women be more problematic than white progressive men? Is that true, or is that just something that's just thrown out there? Fortunately, I have data to look at this. So let's take a look at this. First thing I want to look at is whether or not white progressive women, whether they have more of a fear of, say, conservative Christians, say, Republicans, than others. And the data suggests that they do not. The data suggests that they basically feel that they're as much of a threat as anyone else. So, when it comes to this stereotype of white progressive women being fearful of the other, being more fearful of white progressive men, and because of this fear, they act out, they lash out, they're angrier, meaner than white progressive men. Well, if they are, it's not because they feel they're more of a threat. As you saw from the data, basically about 60% of both men and women, white progressive men and women, feel that because Christians are a threat, and a roughly the same number, maybe slightly less, feel that Republicans are a threat. So let's look at attitudes, because that data came from the Baylor data, the Baylor Religious Survey. This data comes from the National Election Surveys. So let's go back to that chart and look again, and look at what's called thermometer studies. Thermometer questions basically state, on a scale of 0 to 100, how do you rank different groups? So let's look at the differences between men and women. What we find is that when it comes to fundamentalists and conservatives, there's not much difference between the white progressives, men or women. White progressive men and women are a little bit less likely or rate MAGA a little bit lower than white progressive men. But it's significant, but it's really not that big of an effect, from about 6 to 4. Once again, it does not appear to me that white progressive women are worse than white progressive men. Now, I have a larger critique on white progressives in general, and I think that there's not enough work done on them, not enough critical analysis done on them. So everything I apply to white progressives apply to men and women. I'm not letting white progressive women off the hook for my general critique on white progressives, especially educated white progressives. And this is preliminary. Obviously, this is not work that I've published in a peer-reviewed journal. This is not something that I would stand up there and say it would hold up against regression analysis. I don't know that. And right now, I don't have enough interest to really go into doing that aspect. So maybe later on, I'll look at gender differences. But right now, I'm not going to do that. So this is preliminary, and I don't want to say this is the final word. But basically, what I've come to conclude is that white progressive men and white progressive women are basically the same when it comes to the problems pointed out by white progressives. And so I'm going to let the women off the hook here a little bit. I'm going to say that when people say, hey, it's those white progressive women, they're the source of the problem, they're really letting white progressive men off the hook. And indeed, you can argue that this is kind of sexist. It's kind of sexist the way that we're blaming women for a problem in a community where both men and women are part of the problem. One thing I want to say is noteworthy, and you may want to go back and look at the earlier chart, that Christians face more of the animosity, they're feared more, they're ranked lower on the thermometers than Republicans in general, which kind of comports to my argument that the fear white progressives have is more towards Christians than it is towards Republicans. And because of that, I think it's very important for us to think along those lines. And my critique of white progressives really deal with the ways in which white progressives seems to feed into Christianophobia, more so than in anti-conservative bias. There is anti-conservative bias. I'm not denying there's anti-conservative bias. But for me, the problems really come from that Christianophobia that's tied to white progressives. Here, white progressive women are just as guilty, but not more guilty than white progressive men. What I think this says is that we have to be careful about stereotypes. Somehow, images and stereotypes get a feeding, they start getting play, and they just come about it, and we just buy into it without thinking about whether they're true or not. And this video, I'm trying to show you some evidence that the stereotype about the women being worse than the men is not true. And if it was, and they had showed that it was, I would point it out. I have no skin in that gender argument. I have no problem saying, hey, maybe women are worse than men. It's just the data shows they are not. And I hope that this stereotype will tend to go away as we begin to look at more and more data. And we can focus in on what the real problem is, which is white progressives as a general, and the fact they've not been critically analyzed as we analyze other groups, and the problems they may bring to people they disagree with. That's where the focus should be. Does this shatter some paradigms? Paradigms you had about the gender attitudes towards white progressive women as opposed to men? I hope we think about that a little more deeply. I hope you enjoyed this video and this sort of commentary. And if you like it, please like it. Please comment. If you disagree, please comment. And obviously, if you like this sort of conversations, I'm trying to drop at least 2 videos a week. Subscribe. Please subscribe. I can use the subscribers, and I surely really would appreciate that. Well, thank you. And please come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.